Most people think the England of 1957 is gone, not just politically gone, not just economically gone, but physically gone, replaced by retail parks, bypass roads, plastic signage, chain cafes, and the kind of town centers where you could be almost anywhere. And in a lot of places, that is true. The old rhythm was broken. Shopfronts changed, markets shrank, bus depots disappeared, cinemas became discount stores, but not everywhere. In a small number of English towns, something older held on. Sometimes it was poverty, sometimes it was geography, sometimes it was conservation before conservation had a name. And because of that, there are still places where the streets feel one layer removed from the present, where stone, brick, timber, and silence do a strange thing to time. In these towns, 1957 does not feel like history. It feels like it just stepped into the post office and will be back in a minute. These are not towns frozen in an exact year, of course. There are cars, smartphones, delivery vans, and estate agents, but the feeling remains, the scale remains, the street plans remain, the visual logic of an older England remains, and that is what matters. So in this video, we are looking at 10 towns in England that still feel like 1957, towns where the modern world arrived, but somehow never fully took over. The number 10, Haworth, West Yorkshire. Haworth does not feel preserved in a polished museum-like way. It feels lived in, that is the difference. The steep, cobbled main street still pulls the eye uphill the way it must have done generations ago, with stone buildings, small shop fronts, and a kind of visual compression that makes the place feel narrower, older, and more intimate than the modern world usually allows. This is Bronte country, and the literary fame helps, but the real power of Haworth is not just literary, it is physical. The village still carries the shape of an older Pennine settlement. It still feels like somewhere where deliveries arrive late, weather matters, and everything happens on foot, if possible. Source. What gives Haworth that 1957 feeling is not that it looks exactly post-war. It is that it feels like the kind of English place where post-war life could have carried on with fewer interruptions than elsewhere. The slope of the street, the dark stone, the compression of the buildings, the old shopfront rhythm, all of it creates a mood older than convenience. But the trade-off is obvious. Beauty here comes with difficulty. Cobbles are hard on wheels, hard on bodies, and hard on access. Haworth survives because it stayed itself, but that same stubbornness makes it less easy, less smooth, less adaptable than the world around it. That is often the price of atmosphere. Number 9, Burford, Oxfordshire. Burford's high street does not merely slope, it sweeps. It moves downhill in one long visual sentence toward the river Windrush, lined with old stone houses, inns, shop fronts, and frontages that still hold together as a single idea. That is why Burford feels less like a modern town centre and more like a surviving image of provincial England before everything was widened, flattened, standardized, and overlit. It is not just attractive, it is coherent. Burford was a medieval market town, and enough of that structure remains that the place still feels organized around an older social pace. You can imagine butchers' vans, weekly shopping baskets, market day habits, and streets where people still knew the names behind the counters. That is the 1957 feeling here. Not wartime austerity, not nostalgia in a theatrical sense, but continuity. Burford still looks like a town that escaped the ugliest ambitions of the late 20th century. But the trade-off is that places like this rarely stay local in a simple way. Once a town becomes visibly beautiful, it begins attracting outside money, weekend attention, and the kind of admiration that slowly changes who can afford to belong there. Preservation protects the street. It does not always protect the life behind it. And number 8, Sandwich. Kent Sandwich feels improbable. The name is ordinary, the place is not. This was once one of the great Cinque ports, important, connected, and strategically useful. Then the harbor declined as channels silted up, trade patterns shifted, and the reasons for growth began to disappear. Normally, that kind of loss scars a town badly or forces it to rebuild itself into something else. In Sandwich, it did something stranger. It helped preserve it. That is why Sandwich still feels like the sort of English town where a 1957 grocer, schoolboy, churchwarden, and postman would not feel visually out of place. The medieval street pattern still shapes the center. The buildings still talk to one another. The town walls and gates still remind you this place was once understood as defensible, bounded, and complete. It does not feel sprawling, it feels contained. But the trade-off is that preservation by economic slowing is never a romantic story when you live through it. Towns that are spared by decline are not spared kindly. Sandwich looks coherent because growth did not get the chance to do too much damage, but that also means opportunity once ebbed away with the water. Number 7. Tewkesbury, Gloucestershire. Tewkesbury has one of the strongest visual identities of any town in England. Timber-framed buildings, black and white facades, leaning lines, narrow passages, and an abbey so dominant it seems to supervise the entire settlement. This is a place where the built environment does most of the talking. And because so much of it survives in one concentrated area, Tewkesbury still creates the sensation that the decades after the war passed here more lightly than elsewhere. The town is famous for its medieval character, and much of it sits within a conservation area, with hundreds of listed buildings helping lock the visual memory of the place into public life. That is what gives Tewkesbury its 1957 quality. In the 1950s, many English towns still retained a lot of pre-modern physical character simply because the great waves of road widening, signage clutter, redevelopment, and retail standardization had not yet fully landed. Tewkesbury still offers that sensation, but the trade-off is maintenance. Old buildings are not passive scenery. They require money, rules, negotiation, and patience. To live in a place like this is to inherit obligations you did not design. The town looks stable because someone is always paying the price of keeping it that way. Number 6. Wells, Somerset. Wells is technically a city, but it often feels like a town that accidentally acquired a cathedral, and that is part of its charm. There is grandeur here, yes, but not metropolitan grandeur. It is smaller, quieter, and somehow more domestic than you expect. The great stone front of the cathedral is extraordinary, but just as powerful is the fact that the surrounding streets still feel scaled to ordinary life. Nothing captures that better than Vicar's Close, often described as the only fully preserved medieval street in England. It is not just old, it is legible. Stand there and the centuries do not blur, they stack. And because Wells never became large enough to overwhelm its own center, that legibility survives across more of the city than you might expect. The 1957 feeling here is one of civic modesty. Wells still feels like a place where the old institutions remained visible in daily life, where scale was human and status was built in stone rather than glass. But the trade-off is subtle. Towns and cities preserved by smallness often depend on exactly the fragility they cannot control. Too much tourism changes them. Too little money weakens them. Wells works because the balance has held. That balance is never guaranteed. Number 5. Lacock, Wiltshire. Lacock almost feels unfair. It is so visually intact that it can seem less like a real village and more like a set built for the camera, but that is precisely because it is real. Lacock has remained largely unchanged for generations, and its ownership under the National Trust has helped preserve not just individual buildings, but the visual whole of the village. Film and television repeatedly return here because the place does not need to pretend to be older England. It already is. Source. And that is why Lacock feels like 1957, perhaps even more than it feels medieval. Mid-century England still contained many villages where wires, road markings, modern shopfronts, and modern traffic had not yet fully rewritten the visual experience of place. Lacock retains that pre-overwritten quality. It still looks like somewhere where a bicycle against a wall and a dog outside a post office would complete the picture rather than interrupt it. But the trade-off is that perfect preservation can make ordinary life harder to see. When a village becomes iconic, it risks becoming observed more than inhabited. Lacock survives because it was protected. Yet protection can also turn daily life into a performance watched by visitors looking for a version of England they fear has disappeared elsewhere. Number 4. Rye, East Sussex. Rye feels cinematic in a slightly suspicious way, as though it knows exactly how old it looks and has decided not to apologize for it. Cobbled streets, leaning houses, tight corners, weathered facades, and Mermaid Street curving downward with that famous, almost theatrical precision. The whole place seems designed to make footsteps sound louder than usual. Historically, Rye was shaped by maritime importance, invasion, trade, and smuggling. That combination gave the town a seriousness beneath its beauty. It is not quaint in a naive way. It feels guarded. And that helps explain why Rye can still feel like 1957. In the mid-20th century, many English towns still carried a visible memory of older risks: weather, trade, coastal vulnerability, and local reputation. Rye still carries that memory in its streets. But the trade-off is familiar. Atmospheric towns become desirable towns, and desirable towns drift toward exclusivity. What you preserve physically is not always what you preserve socially. Rye still gives you the visual grammar of Old England, Whether it still gives the same belonging to everyone is a more difficult question. Number 3, Ludlow, Shropshire. Ludlow does not need a dramatic gimmick. It simply has density, of history, of street pattern, of listed buildings, of presence. Elements of its Norman street plan are still visible, and the town center contains an extraordinary concentration of historic buildings from different periods, layered rather than erased. That matters because towns do not feel old just because they have one old church or one old inn. They feel old when the whole center still works as a system. Ludlow still does. This is what gives Ludlow that 1957 sensation. It still feels like a county town where administration, shopping, food, habit, and memory remained physically close together. You can imagine a bus arriving, school uniforms crossing a square, a butcher closing early on a Wednesday, and the day collapsing into evening without much help from neon or speed. But the trade-off is that picturesque continuity can conceal economic pressure. Town centers like this must constantly negotiate between heritage, commerce, tourism, and actual local need. The visual survival of a place like Ludlow is impressive. The harder question is always whether the town can remain economically alive without becoming a heritage stage set. Number 2, Stamford, Lincolnshire. Stamford is often described as one of the finest stone towns in England, and for once the praise does not feel inflated. More than 600 listed buildings, long stretches of mellow limestone, and a remarkable degree of urban coherence give it a calm authority that many bigger places lost decades ago. Stamford was also the first conservation area in England, and that is one of the reasons its center still feels so visually disciplined. If one town on this list feels closest to the dream of 1957 without the hardship of 1957, it may be Stamford. There is something in the scale, the stone, the order of the streets, and the restraint of the center that makes it feel like the idea of England many people carry in their heads. But that feeling exists because rules were imposed early enough to stop careless change, and rules, while necessary, are not free. The trade-off in Stamford is that beauty becomes formalized. It is protected, managed, and regulated. That is why the town still looks the way it does. Preservation here was not just luck, it became policy. The result is stunning. The cost is that freedom of alteration was surrendered a long time ago. Number 1, Lavenham, Suffolk. Lavenham is perhaps the purest example of how decline can accidentally become preservation. In the medieval period, it grew rich from the wool trade. Then the trade declined, prosperity faded, and the large-scale rebuilding that might have modernized the town never arrived in the way it did elsewhere. What survived, because people could not afford to replace it, was an extraordinary streetscape of timber-framed houses, crooked lines, medieval scale, and architectural continuity that now feels almost impossible. And that is why Lavenham feels like more than Old England. It feels like interrupted time. By 1957, many places in England still retained fragments of pre-modern life, but few still held them with this much density and visual force. In Lavenham, houses lean because centuries happened to them, not because someone designed them to look nostalgic. The place does not feel restored into charm. It feels aged into it, and that is precisely why it lands so hard. But the trade-off, again, is the same deep English irony. One generation's economic misfortune becomes another generation's heritage treasure. Lavenham is beautiful because it was not modernized when it might have been. The town people admire today exists, partly because an older prosperity failed. What looks like grace from a distance often began as hardship up close. What makes these towns feel like 1957 is not that nothing has changed. Plenty has changed. Cars are different. Money is different. Work is different. The silence is thinner. The pressure is greater. What survives is something more difficult to measure. The visual and emotional shape of ordinary life before England was fully redrawn by late modern convenience. Streets that still bend the old way, buildings still doing their job, centers still scaled to feet rather than traffic flow, places where the past did not retreat behind glass but remained in use, in weather, in stone, in habit. And maybe that is why these towns matter. Not because they let us escape the present, but because they remind us how much of a country's character can be lost by degrees. One frontage, one widening scheme, one careless renovation, one retail unit at a time. In these places, that process was interrupted, delayed, or resisted, sometimes by luck, sometimes by poverty, sometimes by policy. The result is not perfection. It is something better than perfection. It is continuity. If you have ever visited one of these towns, or if there is another place in England that still feels like a vanished decade, Tell me in the comments which one stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy this side of England, the quieter side, the older side, the places where time doesn't disappear so much as settle, then subscribe for more.